Hello and welcome to Global Eye. Leaders of the 32 NATO countries gathered in Washington to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the global alliance. The Russia-Ukraine war remained the top point of discussion. In the joint declaration, NATO called Russia the most significant and direct threat to allies' security. It stated that the deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China and their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut and reshape the rules-based international order are a cause for profound concern. The declaration reaffirmed NATO's unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine, adding that a strong, independent and democratic Ukraine is vital for the security and stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. The members have approved a funding of 40 billion euros over the next year to Ukraine, along with security assistance. It said Ukraine's future is in NATO and the alliance will continue to support it on its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership. The declaration condemned Russia, saying it must immediately stop the war against Ukraine and completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its forces from Ukraine in line with the UN General Assembly resolutions. Further, NATO accused North Korea and Iran of fueling Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine by providing direct military support to Russia. It also said that China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. It also said China poses systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security and accuses the nation of sustained malicious cyber and hybrid activities, including disinformation. Chinese Foreign Minister said that the China-Russia relations are based on the principles of non-alignment, non-confrontation and non-targeting of third parties. Russia called the NATO Declaration Summit a serious threat to the security of the Russian Federation, saying it will require retaliatory measures to contain the alliance. To take this forward, we are now joined by Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, former Indian ambassador to Jordan and Libya and distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. We are also joined by Brahma Chellaney, strategic affairs expert. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Brahma Chellaney, if I could begin with you. The significance of China being called out for the first time by the NATO alliance for supporting Russia's war against Ukraine. What do you think?
This was NATO's strongest ever language against China. NATO has gradually expanded its remit. Its traditional role has been to contain Russia and to safeguard Europe's territorial integrity. But now we are seeing a mission creep, and China is becoming an increasing concern for NATO, in large part because NATO countries are concerned about cyber warfare capabilities of China. China's cyber warfare capabilities are quite formidable. So we are seeing this expansion of NATO's mission. In fact, the fact that leaders of Japan, New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia were present at the NATO Summit. In fact, other than the Australia, which sent a deputy prime minister, the other three countries were represented there, at the head of government level, clearly indicates that NATO's engagement with countries of East Asia and Asia as a whole is growing, and this could actually further provoke both China and Russia, and it could potentially have adverse implications for Asian security.
Right. Important points there. Let me go across to Ambassador Trigunayat. Ambassador Trigunayat, what impact will this have on China in terms of singling them out as a country importing oil and gas from Russia in the biggest manner possible, supplying components, subcomponents to fund Russia's war effort? In fact, reports suggesting that 60 to 70% of components for defense use that Russia is getting right now are all being imported from China. Does this statement, does this allegation in a way single out and pressurize China as well?
Well, as you know that NATO is a tool for the Americans to expand, exercise, and maintain their superiority and power across the world, basically. And they've been able to consolidate this primarily during this Euro-Atlantic alliance during the Russia-Ukraine war. And they are continuing to generate fear among the Europeans about the Russia's intent across. So this will continue to happen like that. They want the flock to follow them, and that's happening. Now, what happens when Trump comes, it'll be seen how it will be played out eventually, or the transactional relationship will begin. Euro security architecture by itself is in its infancy. It has not moved forward much. Riding alone for them is not an option. And China remains the nemesis of the US in this emerging World War 2.0 kind of a scenario. Hence, they have to keep the China factor alive and kicking and as a target, which is at this time, it's not a moving target for them, it's a steady target. And that's precisely what they have tried to bring about. And as far as Russia is concerned, as we know, that Russia has challenged the US hegemony in this warfare militarily, while China is challenging them economically and technologically. So that is a very major challenge for them. And hence, calling out China, you remember that many times all the American officials who have made a beeline to go to China to talk to them, while the Chinese were not very much willing to talk, they wanted to keep China directly not getting involved in this. But if they want to bring in the factors of Russia's oil being bought by China or by other countries, I think that they cannot stop it and they know it. And therefore, it was a 75th anniversary when they wanted to consolidate the factors. And Mr. Chellaney said that they are trying to move into Asia and Southeast Asia. In Jordan also, they have decided to open a coordination office. So now we are looking at that the Quad countries are being promoted, new bases are coming in. So the United States, under the current administration through its deep state, is basically trying to salvage its reputation as the arbiter or the policeman of the world.
Right. So a very strong statement, Brahma Chellaney, has come from the Chinese government via the state media, saying that the US and NATO are showing their bias. NATO's interventions in the past have not really worked, and they're not going to work in this case. They've accused the West of supplying Ukraine with very lethal weapons which are being used to target Russia right now. China has never called out Russia. They've never termed this as a war either. How do you think Europe is going to scale down their investments? Some European countries have said that, yes, if China continues to support Russia in this manner, we will rethink our investments and manufacturing in China. Is that really going to happen? And do you think China may rethink its support to Russia as a result of these strong statements that are coming in from the West?
Both the NATO declaration and then President Biden's comments last night at a news conference both implied that the West would consider possible economic sanctions against Beijing. But such sanctions are unlikely. We have seen that there have been no meaningful sanctions against China over several actions of China. For example, China has locked up more than 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang. No sanctions, no meaningful sanctions against China. China has redrawn the entire geopolitical map of the South China Sea. No sanctions against it of any concrete type. China, in a way, swallowed Hong Kong by squashing its autonomy. Again, it has faced no meaningful sanctions. The fact is this: Xi Jinping wants the Ukraine war to go on because the only country benefiting from that war is China. That war is weakening Russia. It's also sapping the strength of America and its NATO allies. In fact, the Ukraine war has exposed America's military shortcomings. For example, the US is unable to supply munitions to Ukraine in sufficient quantities. The reason is that Russia's industrial capacity to manufacture munitions is greater than the combined munitions manufacturing capability of the entire NATO bloc. So these kinds of military shortcomings that this war has exposed have laid bare the fact that the longer this war rages, both sides in this war, that is the Western Bloc and Russia, are going to be weakened. And the only real winner from this war is going to be China. In fact, already China has emerged as Russia's banker and also has managed to expand the international use of the Chinese yuan. You take a look at Russia's trade. Russia now generates much of its international export earnings in the Chinese currency and keeps those proceeds mostly in Chinese banks in China, in effect giving Beijing a share of the returns.
Right.
So this is a win-win situation for China.
Right. Right. A win-win situation for China, definitely not good for India. Ambassador Trigunayat, we have seen reports of Russia and China conducting military drills very recently. Now, with Russia and China coming very close together and Russia becoming more and more dependent on the Chinese economy for components, for economic support, for financial assistance, is this bad news for China, Russia's pivot to Beijing?
Well, I don't think so.
Bad news for India, I mean.
No, yes. And in fact, this China, Russia, India dynamic is to be seen in a very different context and not simply on the basis of some events that are happening. We have to see the history of Russia and the mindset of the Russians. Russia wants to become a pole by itself. It is not ready to be subjugated. It is weakened, no doubt. And because of that, it needs a China to counter the West. And that's where the No Limits Partnership is coming very handy. But at the same time, they are also very much aware about the Chinese hegemony, and their own history with China has not been that very great. And they know that. And that's precisely the reason that they need an India, whether it is in the SCO, whether it is in the BRICS, or in the bilateral format, or their investments in Far East. All these are related in that sense somehow to balance out the Chinese hegemony. So today we are in the hegemony of two major superpowers, where Russia is trying to find its own balance where to go. So it's obviously it has chosen that it has to be with Russia. Had there been somehow a little good sense that would have prevailed, that the Americans had tried to find some kind of a modus vivendi with Moscow, which it wants forever, now then the Chinese could have been restrained to some extent. But today I agree with Mr. Chellaney that China is a winner in this war. Of course, we should not forget that in this war, the only other country that is really winning through the military-industrial complex is the United States of America. Everybody else is a loser.
Right. Important points there. Let me go back to Brahma Chellaney. Brahma Chellaney, with the NATO in its joint statement, declaration, calling out China for the first time, do you think this is an attempt by US and certain Western countries to make sure that China is always there in public discourse when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, and an attempt to make sure that China is always accused of supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine?
I think we need to keep in mind the fact that President Biden has invested quite a bit of political capital in quoting Xi Jinping. He has invested in personal diplomacy with Xi Jinping to dissuade China from coming to Russia's aid in the war or from opening a front against Taiwan. Now, these are two things that Biden sought to avert. Now, it's very clear, especially from the latest NATO declaration, as well as from Biden's own remarks last night, that his personal diplomacy with China has failed. Xi Jinping is determined to do what he thinks is essential to fulfill what he calls the Chinese dream. The Chinese dream essentially is to supplant the United States as the world's foremost power. His aggressive instincts have been known to everybody. Today, Taiwan faces a bigger threat from China. Coercive pressures from China on Taiwan are increasing, and the Americans are unable to do anything about it, other than provide some arms. And even the arms supplies to Taiwan are lagging several years behind because the Americans Their focus now is on Ukraine. Supplying Ukraine is the primary task of the American policymakers. So Taiwan today is more vulnerable. But to make matters worse for the US, a de facto alliance between China and Russia is emerging. This is largely because of American policy. The US has pushed a reluctant Russia toward China. It has forced Russia to pivot to China. The last thing Russia has ever wanted is to become a sort of a partner or a junior partner, a dependent on China. But unfortunately, what has happened is that thanks to American sanctions policy, Russia has been left with little choice but to develop closer ties with China, which largely work to China's advantage. And this is not conducive to India's interests. That's the reason why Prime Minister Modi was in Moscow. It's very important for India to ensure that Moscow does not align itself too closely with China. The fact that the Western policy is pushing Russia towards China makes it even more imperative for India to engage with Moscow and seek to persuade Moscow that its interests lie with other countries, that it should not become too aligned or too dependent on China.
Okay, let me get a final word on that from Ambassador Trigunayat. Ambassador Trigunayat, just to sum up the Moscow summit between India and Russia, do you think India has managed to emphasize and press on Russia to understand that the India-Russia relationship needs to be valued on its own terms? We have very strong defense ties, energy ties, nuclear ties, and we need those supplies to continue as well. Do you think India has managed to come back with those assurances despite the growing closeness between Russia and China? Ambassador Trigunayat.
Well, frankly, I have no doubt about it. I mean, I have followed and served in Russia for 7 years in different capacities. And I have seen it that as long as Putin is on the scene, I'm not saying the Russia in general, but while Putin is in the scene, he is heavily invested in his relationship with India. And so is Prime Minister Modi. And they have the freest and frankest discussion on every issue. And that's why Prime Minister Modi was telling that the bullets and bombs are not going to get the peace. So there was some kind of an understanding. But at the same time, as far as our critical requirements are concerned, they have, in my view, to a great extent been reassured. And even during our difficulties with Galwan, when we had the supplies problems, despite China's objections, they supplied S-400, they supplied all the equipment and whatever we wanted. There were 49, 43 items that the list was given by our defense minister to the Russians. They gave it. So wherever possible, so they stand with India, and there I don't have any doubt. And I told you that India is a critical pivot for Russia against China as well.
Right. That is an important point to end on. India continues to be a crucial pivot for Russia against China as well. Thank you very much, Chellaney, Ambassador Trigunayat, for joining us on the program. We're taking a short break. But on the other side, Prime Minister Modi also held talks with Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer to boost relations between the two nations. This was a first visit by an Indian Prime Minister since 1983. A special discussion with Hans-Jörg Hortnagel, Commercial Councillor, and Ajay Singh, Head Technology and Innovation at Advantage Austria at the Austrian Embassy, when we return.